Today on Practical Church Planting, we are answering some of the questions that you have submitted about church planting and ministry.
Welcome everybody to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches.
Yes, we will.
Yes, we will. My name is Brian Androsian. That voice you heard was Dylan Dotson. And today we're doing things a little differently. Today we're doing a Q&A.
So we get questions submitted from time to time. Sometimes they're ones that maybe can't do a full episode on, or ones we've done episodes on. And so we thought we would take those and kind of do a bunch of questions in this episode.
Yeah.
And so some of these are questions that have been submitted. Some are ones that I've just heard a lot. And so we thought we'd take a few minutes to answer them. Want to let you know, if you're listening to this, maybe you're driving or something like that, because we've done, about 30-ish episodes so far, some of these have been elaborated in further detail. So I'm going to mention some of those as we answer these questions, if they're relevant, if those previous episodes are relevant to that question. So just make a mental note if you find one that's interesting.
Perfect. So
let's go.
We'll get started here. I have questions. I'll read them off. Dylan will answer them, and we'll talk a little bit if it warrants further conversation. But the first question that we have was simply, are there church planting groups or networks that emphasize rural church planting? So
that's a great question. There might be specifically. So we're not in a rural context, so we didn't really go after that.
Yeah.
In my experience, what I've seen a lot of times is different church networks or denominations sometimes will have divisions or whatever you want to call them that kind of emphasize that. I mean, we're part of Acts 29, so within Acts 29, there's kind of more there's emphasis on urban stuff or rural stuff or different parts of the cultures you're trying to reach. And so a lot of times what I would probably do is I would probably look up these church planting networks and see if they have anything specifically that has to do with rural settings, as that might help you whether or not decide if you want to join this network or not, if they actually have people that are speaking specifically or have conferences or meetups that speak specifically with a rural context.
Yeah, I think another good place to start is to talk to other church planters or church plants that have planted either in your area or in other rural areas.
Yes.
To see
what they're connected to,
who they're connected to, just kind of get some context through them.
But like a lot of times, networks or denominations might have specific teams or groups dedicated to certain contexts. So I would just kind of go online, maybe contact someone and see, hey, do you have anyone that speaks specifically to this type of context specifically? And for your question, rural.
Yeah.
So
perfect. Easy one. Next one. How soon should you move to 2 services?
So how soon should you move to 2 services is a great question.
We're looking for the exact timeline.
There is no exact timeline. Some people like to launch with 2 services. Some people, I think more people often don't because they don't have enough people.
Yeah.
It really all depends on if you should go there or not. I was part of a church, or went to a church for a short amount of time that had 2 services at one of their multi-sites, and it was so obviously clear that they should not be in 2 services. Right. Like if they had combined their 2 services into one, it still would have only filled up maybe half of the room. And so it was kind of painfully awkward. It's like, what are we doing here? The good news about moving to 2 services sooner, or maybe even launching with 2 services, it kind of gets you past that barrier, because when you move from 1 to 2, it can kind of cause a lot of confusion or have to change things up a little bit. But I would say, man, if you are growing, and I mean, the typical rule is 80%-ish full.
Sure.
We want there to be new people. I would say there's no magic number, but I think it can be very detrimental to do it too soon, just so you can say you're at 2 services, or maybe you want to launch with 2 services because it's better for your people who serve and that sort of thing. But if you're not in a space where you need 2 services, people will notice, and I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think this is kind of like 2 sides of the coin thing, because a lot of people say, you hear a lot of stories of we went to 2 services and then things exploded because there was more room and more space and people just felt the whatever. But there's also the case where you cut everything in half and essentially murder your energy.
And my guess is most people that said they went to 2 services and things were exploding, they were probably already growing.
Yes. Yeah.
They didn't just say, hey, we'll just do 2 services now, because you do want, there is something to say about momentum and energy. And when you have a space, regardless how big your space is, if there's only a certain amount of people, let's say it's only 10% full, 10% of 100, let's say you have a 1,000-seat auditorium and you have 100 people. If you have a 100-seat auditorium and you have 80 people, well, that's different.
Sure.
But people will notice, and it will kind of drag your momentum and what you're trying to do if you have 2 services and it's very obvious you don't need them.
Yeah. So I think for this one, it's be realistic. Like I wouldn't wait until you're standing room only.
Yes.
So do it kind of when you're almost at that where you need to do it, but before you're kind of to
and
the
it's kind of like having a baby.
Away.
There's no perfect time.
Exactly.
So you'll always be wondering, I don't know if I should do this. At some point, just know that there's no perfect time. You just got to go for it if you're at that situation.
Exactly. Question 3. I feel God leading me and my family to plant a church. It's great. But we aren't sure where it should be. what advice do you have?
This is one of those things where everyone's always like, they feel God leading them to do something, and they kind of want those like the mat, like the fleece with Gideon or something like that. Like, God, where do I supposed to do this? And I've heard people say this, and I think it's true. Maybe it's not the most spiritual answer, but I think it's the good answer. Where do you want to live?
Yeah,
like that's a great thing. Where do you want to live somewhere? There's churches that need to be there's churches needed everywhere, or maybe you have family or friends in a certain place and you really want to reach them. That's a great thing to do. Sure. At the end of the day, what God is calling us to do is honor Him with our lives, and we can honor Him whether you're in ministry or not. And so I don't know. I think sometimes it gives you a specific, like, I want to be here. Like for me, like we wanted to be in Raleigh, but I think we can over spiritualize it really easy. And so I would say you feel like God's leading you to plant a church. Is there a certain area you feel like God leading? If not, where do you want to live, or where would be interesting to you? Because if you're not excited about the area, people in the area will probably pick up on it pretty easy. Yeah,
the way I kind of think about things like this is, I'm not sure how to word it. Kind of think of it from the flip side. Like if you believe that God is sending you to a certain place, or you don't know where that place is, but that He would be sending you to a certain place, do you think that if you planted a church where you are or somewhere else, that would be dishonoring God? Like, do you think that God is so specific that you have to be in this place, and if you do kind of what He's calling you to do somewhere else, that's going against His will or His calling?
Maybe you do feel strongly you need to be a certain area.
Sure, yeah.
And if you don't, then it's not a disobedience thing. Yeah. It's just that you're not quite sure, and God does. I've made this joke before that I would never live anywhere north of North Carolina because I hate being cold. And people say that's a joke, but I also kind of am kind of serious. Now, granted, if something happened and I felt like I was supposed to, fine. But like, I hate being cold, and I think it's okay to know that God's created us for certain desires in certain ways, and it's okay to lean into that.
And I would say if you feel called to like a certain place, go to that place. You know, if that's the way you are. But if you're like kind of in this question where I don't know where I should be, I think it's the maybe the unsexy answer, but the first place to think about is where you are. Like, not. I know it's like the cool stories to hear to uproot and move across the country or move to the big city and do things in like New York or California where it's really difficult. But think about where you're born and raised, because that's where you're going to have the most influence. That's where you know the most people. And so unless you really feel called somewhere else, and if you do, that's fine. But if not, look at where you are first.
And to take some of the pressure off again, because I think there's all these unspoken rules that we think we have to follow in ministry. Just go where you feel like God's calling you. If you don't feel like He's calling you a particular area, where do you want to go? Why do you like certain places? Maybe that's where you should go.
Yep. Cool. Next question. What is the best way to grow participation in small groups?
Participation in small groups. So there's a couple things you could do. We've talked about this before. So episode 7, we talked about Dinners for 6, which is something we did at New City Church when we launched.
It's a classic.
Where it was over the summer. It was 3 months long. Basically, once a month, we put people in groups of 6 or 8 and said, you're going to have dinner at their house. You're going to rotate once a month for 3 months. Super laid back, really easy thing to do. So that when we launched groups in the fall, people actually had relationships and they knew each other because we were a brand new church.
Right.
So in terms of just like launching groups and actually maybe having more than one, that's something that you could do is Dinners for 6. Go to episode 7 and listen to it if you want more information about that. But then when it comes to what was it talk about? Was it multiplying groups or growing groups?
Growing participation.
The kind of the standard answer is to multiply your groups. That's what people normally say. You're supposed to multiply your groups.
Sure.
Now we've talked about, and can't find the episode right here. I'm trying to look it up. We've talked about before about why you should not multiply groups. And basically what we're saying is, well, why don't you talk a little bit about that while I look it up? Why should people not multiply groups, Brian? Why do we take a different approach?
So multiplying groups generally comes with splitting groups. Generally comes with taking this person raising up to be a leader, sending them out with part of the group, and the group kind of splits in half. And in theory, it's great because it makes 2 new groups and everybody's happy. But in reality, that's not really how it works. In reality, what you're doing is you're taking a healthy group and then essentially slicing it in half. You're taking a group that people have built relationships with, built trust with, that takes time, and that isn't easy, and then kind of essentially almost punishing them for building relationships. Punishing them in the sense of separating them from the people that they built relationships with to then bring in new people that don't have those relationships and that have to start over.
So that is episode 13. Okay. I just found it. Go episode 13. Everyone says multiply groups and that's how you grow groups. I've actually never seen that done well. People talk about it, but no. And if you've been a part of groups that multiply, we don't like how it's just nobody likes it. And so we talk about in an episode why that's not a bad thing and why you shouldn't. So what we do at New City Church is we don't multiply groups. We say this is your group and you're stuck to it, and not stuck to it. I mean, if you don't like it, we'll switch you out.
Yeah.
But what happens is then people actually like their community group, is what we call them, whatever you want to call your groups, so that they tell people to join them.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing worse than like being in a group out of obligation or because you feel like you're supposed to. But when you actually enjoy it, you'll tell other people.
Yep.
And so when groups are full at New City Church, we do not add anyone else to the group unless someone moves away or something happens and they have an open spot. Instead, we just create new groups. And if we're in a season where, like right now, where all of our groups are pretty much maxed out, we will tell people if they want a group on a certain night that isn't available, hey, we don't have any groups available right now. When we do another groups push in January, however often we do them, we will have a group for you then. So people know that there's nothing worse than saying you want to join a group and nobody tells you what to do.
Sure.
So it's not like no and sorry. It's no, but we're going to follow back up with you soon. But I would say if you create groups that people enjoy, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
And for at New City Church, we don't multiply them so that people actually enjoy them. They have relationships. They spread the word. And then when we say that they're important, people aren't being like, well, you're just saying that. And they're like, no, that is important because it's impacted me. I think that's the big thing too, is we all talk about groups are great. But then you have people in your groups and they're like, well, mine's not that great.
Right.
And so
Right.
that really hurts multiplying and growing and increasing the number of people involved. But if people enjoy their groups, and then you can say it from stage with integrity, that's how more people get involved.
Yeah, and I think one kind of difficult thing about multiplying groups is it makes it harder to actually raise up leaders if you're constantly slicing up the group. And so keeping the group as one, moving throughout the seasons, I think it's much easier to raise up leaders, and then that leader will go and lead their own group and with a new group of people, And I think it's much easier to raise them up when you're with the same group of people for a long period of time and able to actually invest in people instead of it kind of always changing around.
So episode 13, why we don't multiply groups. Also, if you're interested, episode 19, we talk about how to do sermon-based groups, which is what we do at New City Church, which also seem to go really well.
Yes. So if you haven't gathered, we think groups are very important.
We do.
Next question. What is the best time for worship service? Simple as that.
Man, great
Give them the simple
question.
time.
I saw a poll done, I think on Facebook recently, in a group I was in, and they actually answered what I thought was the best. So there's really no best time.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we try to get a little bit fancy when we plant churches, and so we'll try to do like an evening time on Sunday or a Saturday, and now of course space, if you have to, that's different. But time and time again, what we've seen, what I've others seen, and there's probably research done on this too, because I've seen it so many times. I don't think it's just like what the few people I've talked about in my own experience. Sunday morning is what people think about going to church.
Sure.
So Sunday morning is the best time. Now, if you have, for space reasons, have to do Sunday afternoon because maybe a church letting you use it for free, totally get that.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about optimal time, Sunday morning still is when people think that they're supposed to go to church, especially people that, even if they're not Christians, are kind of assuming, Sunday morning, that's what I do.
Yep.
So Sunday morning. Within that, before we did two services, we did 10 a.m., which is what this poll that I saw with a bunch of ministry people, that was actually like by far and away the biggest one.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a best time.
Right.
And again, it does kind of depend on your culture and society and where you were meeting. Maybe that seems, but like 10 o'clock seems to be not too late, but also not too early.
Yeah. This kind of seems like one of the decisions when it comes to church planning that people probably put a lot more thought into than needed, Like if this is granted, you have freedom to plan or to have services at whatever time you want, obviously, if your space permits. I would say whether it's 10 o'clock or 10:30 or 11 or 9:30, pick it and stick with it.
Yeah. And it's okay to change it.
Yeah.
It is okay.
Yeah. I don't mean stick with it forever. I just mean make the decision.
I think that's part of the stress too. It's like, we got to make it. And if we can't ever change it, like we just went, this is a side note, we just went to two services and changed one of our service times 3 weeks in.
Yeah.
And it's okay. I think, again, it's one of those unspoken rules that you can't do anything. Find what works. If you do 10 o'clock and it's not working, move it up, move it down. Like, it's okay.
Yeah. Think long term. Like if in your first couple of months you have to change, that may affect things for a minute, but think about next year. No one's going to remember last year when you changed times. Just don't stress too much about what exact time is going to be.
That's good. We're coming up on 15 minutes, but this is great. So let's do another one.
15 minutes or longer, we should
That's
have said. 2 more questions. All right. How can we increase the number of people who volunteer?
That's a great question. So we talk about, at New City Church, we don't use the term volunteer, we use the term serving, but obviously volunteer is what people think or what they understand. The thing that we often want to do is kind of either program or just say it from stage. So we think if I make an announcement and we do this big sign up, that's how we'll get more people to serve.
Yeah.
While that may be helpful a little bit, that's actually not the best way. Brian, what's the best way to get people to serve?
Word of mouth.
Word of mouth and
You may have heard of it.
personal invitation.
Yes.
That's really the best way to do it.
Yes,
Now,
asking and speaking to people.
if you're going to, I don't know, 2 services like we are, and we were, and so it's kind of easier to do, like, oh, they kind of need it. But the best way to do it is just for people who serve to invite their friends in on serving, and people who lead the teams who serve, going out of their way to invite people in. Personal connection is really the best way to do it, and I think a lot of times we want to find ways around that, like a quick fix. There is no quick fix. The best way to do it is simply to have communication and personal invitation, and let people see the need that way.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to do it is to recognize strength that somebody has, and tell them that you see this strength, whether it's they're great with kids or they're very friendly, they'd be great at hospitality, and tell them that you see this strength in them, and you think they would do really well serving the church in this capacity.
And as a side note, on episode 12, if you're looking for more episodes, we talk about our membership, why it's important. We call it partnership. That is one of the things we ask if you join New City Church, that you have to serve in some capacity, because this is your church. So that is one way to do it, as people are wanting to learn more and be like, hey, this is part of our process. And I think people understand.
Yeah.
So that's an easy way to do it too. Tell people that, hey, if this is your church, let's make it your church. Let's serve.
Yep. I think what you said was good. There's no quick fix around it. It's just a matter of talking to people, letting them know that there's a need, and letting them know where you think they would be good. Have anything, Dad?
I think that's great.
Last question. Oh, how sad.
How sad.
It's a simple one. When's the best time of year to start a church?
When is the best time of year to start a church?
Well, the best time of year and the best time of day. This will be.
There you go.
How can you fail with this church?
The traditional calendar kind of says September or January.
Yeah.
Increasingly, I don't think that matters as much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we see this here at New City Church because we not predominantly, but our biggest demographic is college and 20s. So we see a lot of young people. I guess it's kind of where the culture is growing. And we've seen, now this is our second fall. We launched in April of 2017, that we do not follow the traditional patterns at all.
Right.
The biggest reason is we don't have a lot of families with kids in the traditional school calendar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of them families we have either homeschool or do year round, which is becoming weird. Now, if you live in a place where it's only traditional school year, that's different.
Yeah.
But I think that's easy. January, September, I think those are great times, but I wouldn't say like you have to wait.
Sure.
Like, let's say you're building a launch team and you're ready, and there's momentum growing, and it's March, and you're like, well, we didn't launch in January, so let's just sit around till September.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you should do that.
Yes.
At New City Church, our plan originally was to launch in January, but we couldn't find a space, which is a whole other story. Finally got a space, and we launched in April, which was great. It would have been a terrible decision to wait until September to launch, because we had already been through the launch phase and gotten ready to go. It wasn't. Now, again, it's not the best time of year because it's coming up on summer, but guess what happened this summer? July was our biggest month ever, and then August was even bigger than that. And so you should pay attention to the school calendar, but I wouldn't get so caught up in having to pick a timeline when it seems like God is moving and things are getting ready to go.
That's what I was going to say. Don't sabotage yourself or sabotage God trying to find like the optimal time if things are working.
Right. Now, again, I wouldn't do like July 4th weekend or Thanksgiving or Christmas or like even Super Bowl Sunday, maybe not. But, so maybe be mindful of the specifics, the day.
Yeah.
But in terms of like the season, I think if it seems like things are going well, I wouldn't be so focused on we have to wait until the second Sunday in January or the second Sunday in September.
Yeah.
So
obviously, when you start the process, you should have some time frame in mind to tell people when you're obviously speaking to them about the church.
And that's a great thing about the process is a lot of times, again, our plan was January, maybe your plan was September. That's great. But as you start the launch process and things change, and maybe you're growing more than you thought, or you're not growing as much as you thought, and you're like, well, it's September, we have to launch now. I think that can really be destructive to what you're trying to do. Yeah. So January, September are kind of the best times, but they're not the only times if God's doing something and you need to delay or start sooner.
Yeah, I think this is one of those tough things in leadership where when you make a decision, you need to be able to stick with your decision, but you also need to be flexible enough to recognize if things need to change. Yep. If you say this is when we need to go, but however, we're a few months back and we have everything ready and people are ready to go, then there's no reason to just sit around.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for submitting your questions. If this was interesting and fun,
this was fun to me.
Submit some more questions. practicalplanning.com/questions, and we'll talk about them in a future episode. If we get a bunch of them, we'll do another episode like this.
Yep.
And until then, we'll see you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
subscribe.
See you next time.